to invite you to think for a minute about your worst day ever at work. The hardest day you ever had at work, the day when you wish you just stayed in bed and hit snooze a few more 18 times. And maybe that was in the realm of your vocation and what you do for a living, how you earn a paycheck, or maybe it was in the realm of chores or other things. But think about the worst day of work that you can ever remember. President Teddy Roosevelt certainly had one day that probably made the top 3 of his worst days. I would imagine the worst day that he ever had at work. After he had served as president and was out of the office, he decided that he should run for a 3rd term as president of the United States. And so he was hitting the campaign trail, and one day he was staying at a hotel someplace, and there was a car waiting for him to whisk him off to his next campaign speech. And as he came down out of his room, walked out the door, there happened to be a gunman waiting on the street for him, who approached President Roosevelt and fired at him straight at his chest at point-blank range. Teddy Roosevelt collapsed to the ground. His entourage there swooped in, and one of them put the gunman in a half Nelson. He ended up spending the rest of his life, the gunman did, in an asylum as they figured out that he was not altogether there. And the doctor, while they were whisking away the gunman, a doctor quickly ran over and began to pay attention to President Roosevelt and was relieved to find that Roosevelt was breathing, he had a good pulse, he was dazed but still coherent, and he said, "We need to get this man to a hospital." President Roosevelt, laying there on the ground, reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and coughed into it, and saw that there was no blood on the handkerchief, so he said, "Get me to that speech." And so you do what President Roosevelt says. So he jumped in the car, and they whisked him off to the campaign speech, and he stepped up on the platform where the speech was to be given, and he stepped to the microphone and he said, "My friends, I need to ask you to be today as quiet as you possibly can be." He said, "I don't know whether you know that I've just been shot." And everyone gasped. And he pulled back his coat and revealed the blood stain on his chest where the bullet had been struck. And he reached into his pocket and he pulled out the 50 pages of speech notes that were doubled over in his pocket. And you could see where the bullet had gone through those speech notes. He said, "I don't know whether you know that I've just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And he said, "I need to apologize that this is probably going to be a short speech." And he went on and gave a 90-minute campaign speech. If a 90-minute campaign speech is a short speech, what you're going to get here this morning is probably a starter kit. I don't want to hear any complaints about the length of this sermon today. And after the speech was done, his shirt was thoroughly soaked in blood. He made his way to the hospital, and they checked it out and found that the bullet was lodged in his chest muscle. And they opted to leave it there, and it stayed there until he died several years later. That's an all-time bad day at work, I think. I think that's about as bad as it gets. And you probably had some days like that at work where you feel like you're getting shot at, people are trying to pick you off, where things are so bad you think, "I should have just stayed in bed." And I hope you have lots of days where you feel like you're on the mountaintop. I hope you have very few days where you feel like it's that bad of a day. But we're in a series right now at Victory called Find Your Calling. We're trying to help you to find what God has made you to be, to think about your vocation and your calling in terms of how God thinks about your vocation and calling, and to find that particular thing that God has gifted you to be able to do. One of the best descriptions of calling that I've ever come across comes from Frederick Buechner, who says, "Your calling is the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need." And that's the journey we're on through this month of helping you to hopefully discover that. In addition to the series, over the next few weeks, we're going to do something a little bit unique. And I shared a story. This comes from a story I shared a couple weeks ago as we started this series. I told the story about a friend of mine who was off at a Christian youth conference, and there during the conference, somebody gave the invitation, if you feel called to be a pastor or be a missionary, to respond and come forward, and they were going to pray for them. And his older brother was perturbed by the whole thing and was frustrated. And you may remember the story if I shared it, if you were here that week, how his brother said, "I feel called to be a high school basketball coach, but I guess that doesn't count." And so I was talking to Vaughn Van Sciver, one of the pastors here, and he said, "We still do that oftentimes in church settings. We still often do that at youth camps. So we want to counteract that a little bit through this series. And for the next 3 weeks, we're going to have these sheets out in the lobby at the welcome desk. Just say, 'I'm called to be.' And we want to invite you to fill that out, how you feel called. And I've been blessed to hear a lot of the stories over the last few weeks of people saying, 'I know exactly when God called me to be a therapist, or when God called me to be a counselor, or when God called me to be a teacher or a nurse or whatever it might be.' And we want to invite you to fill that out because those all count. And if you know that you know that you know that God has called you to your career or to your vocation or to something that you do as a voluntary basis, we want to honor that, and we're going to have the great Connor Flynn out in the lobby by the welcome desk to take little snapshots of everybody who fills out one of these and holds it up as a way of dignifying your calling and lifting up your calling, that your calling counts. And if you don't know what that calling is in terms of, like for me, this would be, I'm called to be a pastor. You might say, I'm called to be an educator. If you don't know what that is, then it also counts to write, I'm called to be a Christ follower, or I'm called to be a grace giver. I'm called to be a friend, or I'm called to be a mother or a father or a son, whatever that might be for you. And we're going to have this out there the next few weeks, and the second weekend of October, we'll have that all compiled as we celebrate all the various ways that God is calling us. All right? I want to let you know before we jump in this morning as well that we had our kickoff weekend last weekend. And last weekend, and when the dust had all settled, we looked back and realized that it was the biggest crowd we've had in kids ministries since we reopened in 2020. And absolutely, we're bursting at the seams with kids and families down the hall at the kids wing. We're so grateful for the work that Laura Rascala and her team are doing in Kidsmen. And we were basking in the glow of that as a team. And then on Wednesday, our teens gathered for the first time during this academic year. And we had the biggest night of mix for our middle school and high schoolers that we've had since we reopened in 2020. And so just so grateful for Brad and the work that he and his team are doing with Victory Student Ministries. And I got to tell you, you ain't seen nothing yet. I'm so excited for what God is doing with our young people, with our students and our kids, and can't wait to see what God continues to do in our midst, and really grateful to get to be a part of it. But this morning, we're going to take a look at a story from the life of Jacob, who's one of the patriarchs, and what was, without a doubt, probably the worst day that he ever had at work. And we find this in Genesis chapter 29, beginning of verse 14. This is what we find. After Jacob had stayed with Laban for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." And now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older one was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. So Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, It's better that I give her to you than to some other man, so stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. What a romantic story. "Hey, Mom and Dad, how did you meet?" "Well, son, your grandfather made your dad work for 7 years, and instead of paying him, he gave me to him. Why didn't Grandpa just pay Dad for those years?" "I don't know. That's a good question. Why don't you go ask Grandpa right now at Thanksgiving dinner?" This is kind of a messed up story. Now, there's a lot of history of these kind of situations of dowry. There's some people who say that part of this payment, or like the giving of a dowry, was to provide for the bride in case the husband were to die in some case. But I'm thankful we've moved past this. We're not doing this anymore. I hope you're not doing this. If you're doing this anymore, stop it, knock it off. But this is what we find here in the case of Jacob and his wife-to-be Rachel. But the key line I want you to focus on, this isn't a sermon on strange marriage arrangements. This is a sermon on work and the worst day of your work career. And notice that the thing that it says about Jacob, that even though he had to work 7 years for his wife, it was like a day. So those 7 years felt like just a day because of his deep love for Rachel. Isn't that as good as it gets? Now that's kind of romantic. But there are going to have days like this for you, days where the work just blows by, where 7 years feels like a day. And then there are other times when a day feels like 7 years, and you're going to live within these polar opposites. But watch what happens in verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, my time is completed." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. That's the other sister. Yada, yada, yada. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" And so the wedding day comes after all these 7 years, and the father-in-law Laban does a great switcheroo, gives him the other sister, and he doesn't realize it till the morning. You might be wondering, how in the world did Jacob not realize this until the next morning? Well, stay sober, my friends. Be careful. This isn't a sermon about sobriety, but be on your best alert and be careful. And I think most of us would notice if it's the wrong bride at the end of the aisle on our wedding day. Jacob apparently was beyond that point and didn't realize what was happening. And we could look at all the factors that are going on here, but here's the big thing I want you to notice, because quickly, overnight, his dream job turned into a nightmare. Quickly, overnight. I mean, he goes from 7 years feeling like a day to suddenly it's all gone sideways. It's all gone wrong, and his dream job has deteriorated into a nightmare. Last weekend, we talked about this chart where we looked at your life's work and what constitutes your life work and how this fits into your overall life. And we talked about how within your life's work, there is the work in the school that you do, your job, how you earn an income, the schooling that you're a part of. We looked at how there's the chores that you have to do, the things that you have to do that probably nobody pays you to do. You just have to do mowing the lawn, changing diapers, that sort of thing. And then there's that third circle, which is volunteering. And those three sectors are what constitute your life's work. And you've got life beyond that. There's leisure and luxury, and there's good times you get to have and vacations you get to go on and watching soccer games and that sort of thing. But your calling is most likely going to take place within those three overlapping circles of your work, of your life's work. And the most meaningful work that you get to contribute, your deepest sense of calling is going to occupy that territory. But on the other side, there's also a lot of deep pain that comes in that area. There's deep fulfillment, deep pleasure, deep joy that comes from the work that we get to contribute, whether we're paid for it or not. But there's also a lot of significant pain and strain that comes in those sectors. You may have heard at some point about the Holmes Rahe stress inventory. This has been around for about 50 years. And this inventory was gathered as a way of looking at the biggest stress factors in our life. And they looked at all the different things that can happen in your life that are really stressful, the most significant stressful things. And they ascribed a score to each of these, the top 40 or so of these stress inventory factors. And they said that the higher your score is, the more likely you are to have a stress-related health issue. And so the top number two things on that list are the death of a spouse and a divorce, 100 points and 73 points respectively. But then there's other things on there like job loss, 47 points, changing careers, 36 points, change in work responsibilities, 29 points, starting or finishing school, 26 points, changing schools, 20 points. And it's really interesting when we look at this list, there's about 40 things on the inventory, and about 1 out of every 4 items on that list are related to school or work. That work and your calling and your vocation and what you do day to day can be a place of deep joy when you get it right. But when it goes wrong, it cuts like nothing else. It is deeply painful and one of the most stressful things you can experience. I don't know if I've ever mentioned that I'm a big Bills fan. Have I ever mentioned that before? I lose track of these things, and God bless you. And a few years ago, the Bills had been through a pretty lean stretch of time. They're terrible for pretty much ever. And then finally, Josh Allen arrived, the team began to turn around, and there was some excitement. And so there was an offseason a few years ago where, for the first time that anybody could remember, people were picking the Bills to make the playoffs and maybe to win the whole thing. And Coach Brian Dable, who was the offensive coordinator for the Bills at the time, realized that there was a chance that this might be going, all the press, all the publicity, all the accolades that were coming before the season even started, had a chance to maybe work against the team and get into their heads. So he gathered the whole offense together. He sat them all down, and all the coaches and all the players, and he said, I want you all to stand up. And he had them all stand up, and then he turned to the coaches first. He said, coaches, if you've ever been fired, sit down. Every single coach in the room sat down. He said, okay, players, if you've ever been cut or traded, sit down. And majority of the players sat down. He said, if you weren't picked in the first round, sit down. The rest of the players sat down. So at this point, he's got all the coaches, all the players in the room, everybody in the room is sitting down. Everyone has been eliminated at this point, except for one person, number 17 on the roster, Josh Allen, the star quarterback. And he looked at Josh and he said, Josh, how many scholarship offers did you get coming out of high school? And Josh said, 0, coach. And he sat down. And Coach Dable that day said, let's remember where we came from. Let's not get too big for our britches. Let's remember the journey we each had to get to this point and not get too big for our britches. Let's remember where we came from. What I want you to know is that detours are a part of the journey, not the end of the road. We're all going to have these kind of detours. We're all going to have these kind of setbacks. Work can be such an important and fulfilling part of your life, whether it's what you get paid for or not what you get paid for. It can be such an important part of human flourishing, but it can also be a place of deep personal pain. And sometimes when those detours hit, it can be really easy to feel sidelined, to feel like it's the end of the road. It's not the end of the road, it's just a detour. Those detours are part of the journey, not the end of the road. And if we were to kind of do something like that here today, and I asked all of you to stand up and said, sit down if you've ever failed a test in school, if you've ever failed a test, or if you ever failed a driver's test, if you've ever been laid off or fired or gotten furloughed because there wasn't enough work to be done, if you've ever been dumped or divorced, or if you've ever gotten a speeding ticket, pretty soon all of us will be sat down here pretty quickly because we've all had a detour or two in our lives. Detours are a part of the journey, not the end of the road. But right now, Jacob is frustrated. He's married to the wrong woman. His father-in-law duped him. And so he says, "Why did you do this to me?" It says in verse 28, Laban replied, "Well, it's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, and then we'll give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife, yada, yada, yada. And his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban for another 7 years. Notice how in this moment, the first thing that Jacob does is he's casting his father-in-law in the role of the villain. How did you do this to me? How could you do this to me? And it'd be fun to have some debate right now about who's to blame in this scenario. Is it Laban? Is it Jacob? I don't think anybody would blame the daughters for this. They feel like victims in this whole unfolding story. It's interesting to me that some Bible scholars, multiple Bible scholars, say that Jacob has met his match. This is exactly the sort of thing that Jacob does throughout his life. He's always tricking other people and pulling the wool over people's eyes, and it's amazing just to see Jacob meet somebody who can dupe him, who can trick the trickster. But at this point, something that's really interesting to me is that this feels like an incredible detour. This is the worst day that Jacob has ever had at work, but all of God's best stories begin as detours. An unplanned pregnancy led to Christmas. Moses, on the run for his life, led to the Exodus and the Hebrew slaves being released from their slavery in Egypt. Peter, on a night when he couldn't find any fish, ended up being found by the Messiah. Paul, when he was Saul and was out breathing threats against the Christians and persecuting the Christians and throwing them in the jail, it led to him having an encounter with the living Christ, which led to him preaching the gospel boldly throughout the Mediterranean, which led to the message of the gospel being proclaimed to all Gentiles, which led to the gospel coming to the Twin Tiers of New York State and Pennsylvania. All of God's best stories begin as detours. Feel like it's maybe the end of the road, but no, it's just a detour, and God has taken us in a place we never could have dreamed we could go. Throughout this series, we're sharing stories, and we've been hearing testimonies of different people within our church of how this has played out in their own lives, their relationship with their work and their vocation and calling. And this week, I want to share with you my story. About 10 years ago, I was pastoring a great church south of Buffalo in a town called North Collins, and we were on a roll, as good a roll as I've ever seen a church be on. I'd been there for 8 years, which is the longest any pastor had ever served that church. And we had experienced 8 consecutive years of growth at that church. We were just on a roll. We were just in a really sweet spot. Lots of people coming to Christ, a lot of people getting baptized. My last pastoral vote was a unanimous vote asking us to stay for as long as we would like. And that sort of thing doesn't happen to me very often. So it was really kind of wonderful to have a group of people where we were on a roll, we were getting along. It was really sweet. We had every reason in the world to stay there forever. And then Houghton called. Houghton is where Tammy and I went to college, and it's where we met. It's our alma mater. We love that campus. We love being a part of things there. And it was just flattering to have my alma mater call and ask if I'd consider coming back for a role there on campus. And we said, well, gee, that's awful flattering. I don't know if we're going to leave what we're doing because we're on such a roll. You don't walk away from things like this, but we'll at least when your alma mater calls, you have to at least have the conversation, right? And so we had the conversation, and the conversation turned into a calling. And so we moved our family to Houghton, and I had a really unique and special role, but probably 2 of the most significant things I got to be a part of. I got to start a program. It's called Equipping for Ministry, which is for helping adults who were feeling called, ironically, to be a pastor or missionary, to take the courses they needed in order to become a pastor or missionary. And it was really meaningful. I got to teach a bunch of those classes. I thought we'd have some pastors come from New York and Pennsylvania. We end up having pastors come from California and Brooklyn and Texas and Canada, from all over North America to come and take these classes. And I thought we'd just offer classes right there on the campus of Houghton, but we ended up striking up partnerships with churches in Maryland and Pennsylvania and doing some stuff online. And it was really deeply fulfilling, and some of the relationships I got to form with students in that time has continued to this day to be really meaningful. In addition, one of the other really significant things I got to be a part of was we had ministry teams that went out from campus, and they go to camps and churches and different events. And we started out with 6 students that were doing this in the beginning, and it grew to 86 students who were going out on these teams. About 1 out of every 10 students on Houghton's campus was a part of these teams. And we were just watching them impact lives for Christ and serve with a heart like Jesus. It was deeply meaningful, deeply moving to be a part of it, and loved getting to invest in those students. I wasn't a part of the enrollment team, but it was a time when enrollment was really a challenge at Houghton, and a lot of the normal pipelines for enrollment were drying up, and I had friends in the enrollment office who came to me and said, what you're doing, all of our other numbers are going down, but the work you're doing is driving enrollment in a way that's bucking all the trends. And I remember one of my friends and colleagues in that office said, you got to be the safest person on campus right now. And I said, why? I said, because we're struggling to find students who want to come to Houghton, and all the work you're doing, these students you're sending out, they're just creating a really pretty wonderful pipeline. And I remember when she said that because it was February 2020. A couple weeks later, the world shut down. A couple days after that, all the students on campus had to be sent home, which is just devastating for a campus like that. Pretty soon, this busy schedule that I had of scheduling event after event, I hardly had any white space on my calendar, scheduling events and sending out teams and events we were hosting. All of that went away overnight. And I went from being really, really busy and essential to being really optional. And then one day in May, I got an email with a meeting request to meet with the college president. And I knew what that meant. That's the former president of Houghton, not the current president. And I knew what that meant. In spring of 2020, over 20 million people lost their jobs. And I'm one of them. But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. It was, without a doubt, one of the hardest journeys we've ever could have gone down. It was really hard, really painful. I've honestly never even talked about it publicly until today. The hardest part, without a doubt, was what I knew it meant for my kids and for my family. The disruption and the turmoil that was going to create. Incredibly difficult, incredibly painful. In the back of my mind, I kept thinking, we had that great church where things were going so well, and they wanted me and everything, and did I blow it by leaving that? Did I get it wrong? Did God really call us to this? Was I supposed to stay back there? Well, I'm one of the lucky ones. At that season of our lives, I was on the preaching team at a great large Wesleyan church in Buffalo, and the lead pastor there, when he found out about our situation, he basically wouldn't take no for an answer. He said, you don't need to send your resume to anybody else. You don't need to brush up your resume. Don't talk to anybody else. He said, come here. We want you here. And that of course, meant so much in that particular moment. And we had a few opportunities we were considering, but we laid them on the table for us as a family. And I actually got my offer letter from them before I got my severance letter from Houghton, which is not how it normally works. We're blessed, and it turned out really well for us. But then 6 months later, that pastor who pursued me so hard resigned to go to a church back in Michigan, his home church back in Michigan. I said, come on, man, what are you doing here? But I said, okay, Lord, maybe this is why you brought us here. Maybe we're here for such a time as this for me to be considered to be the lead pastor of that church. Well, it was late 2020, early 2021, and the church felt at that time that the best thing for the church was for the longest tenured pastor of the church there, who was a friend of mine and a good pastor, for him to step in as the lead. And he was the only one they considered, the only one they talked to. And I said, that's fine. I totally get it. And Lord, here we are. However you want to use us here, I don't need to be in that lead pastor seat to be used by you, and however you want to use me. But we were in that season of figuring out, okay, Lord, this has been quite a ride here. Losing my job in May. In December, we find out that the lead pastor who recruited me is leaving, and what are we doing here? We're just trying to recalibrate our hearts on this. It was at that time I had a really pivotal conversation with my dad. And I've shared this story before, but now you're getting to see the whole context of this conversation. And I was saying, none of this has gone how we thought it would go, but we're trying to make the most of it, recalibrate our hearts for this. And my dad, who is pretty much allergic to change, whose MO was always to say, make it work, keep your head down, just go about your business, said, I don't think you're where God needs you to be yet. And he said, you're going to get a phone call. There's going to be phone calls that come for you. And I hope that you'll take the phone calls. I hope that you'll be open to the opportunities that God might have for you. And a few weeks later, my dad died. A few months after that, Victory began the journey of looking for a new lead pastor. And all I can tell you is the journey that God took us through, what felt like the worst case scenario, what felt like the end of the world, ended up being the journey that we would say in hindsight was the journey we had to go through for God to prepare us for victory, literally and figuratively. And in preparing for this week, I talked to each member of my household because I said, this is not just my story, it's our story. It's something we all experience as a family. And I wanted to give them the chance to veto it, but also to get their reflections on what this journey was like for us. And I asked each of them, would you say we're better off, as hard as this has been, as unwelcome as this was, as much as we never would have chosen this, would you say we're better off for this? And every one of them said, oh, yeah, absolutely. To quote Hannah, oh, 100%. They're like, without a doubt. Like, in fact, some of the members of my family, I didn't even have to ask the question, do you think we're better off for this? Just as we began talking about this journey we've been on for the last few years, some of them cut me off to say, yeah, but look at what God did. Look at what God has done for us. Look at how God has provided for us. Look at the transformation that has happened in our hearts through this journey. I never would have picked that. That was the end of the world when it happened. But it was a detour that God took us on to put us on the road to victory. And this is the reason I want to share this to you, because this could have been what felt like the end of the world, and it wasn't even the end of our journey with Houghton. This is the amazing thing. So often something like that, you kind of feel like, that's it, I'm going to burn that bridge over there and forget that ever existed. Well, we've remained connected to Houghton. Tammy still works as the director of Houghton Online. Hannah's now a sophomore at Houghton, having a wonderful experience. I've even been invited back to speak in Houghton's chapel this spring, which is a real special delight to get to go back and serve in that way. We've enjoyed getting to know the new president there. It hasn't even been the end of that journey of a place that's been so significant to us. What felt like the end of the world was just God taking us on a detour to take us on the road to something more special and more meaningful than we ever could have imagined. I need to share that with you because I need you to know that the season we're in right now at Victory is extra sweet because of the road that we took to get here. That the 98.3% vote to invite us to come to Victory hits different when you've been through the journey we've been through. That the growth we experienced last year, that the 67 people who got baptized this past summer, that the incredible days we've had just recently in kids ministry and in student ministry, they hit different when you've been through the journey that we've been through. And we're so grateful to be here. And when we drove home from our candidating weekend last year, a year and a half ago, my family can attest to you, I sobbed. Ugly cries, snot and everything going everywhere. It was ugly. Just over the overwhelming sense of, all my life you've been faithful. And that terrible road was worth it for the place that you brought us to. And so many of us are going to have a detour. So many of us are going to have really meaningful, rich times in our work and our vocation and our calling. And you're also going to have days where you just wish you'd slept in that morning. You're going to have days where it feels like a gunman is out on the street trying to take you out. We're going to have detours. And this is so much of why I love this story of Jacob and Laban and Leah and Rachel, not because of how it ends in the book of Genesis, but how it ends generations later in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1, the first two verses. Look at this. It says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. And I'll let you have one guess as to who the mother of Judah was. It wasn't Rachel. It wasn't the wife that Jacob had worked 7 years for. It was the other sister. It was this messed up, terrible situation. The worst day that Jacob ever had at work was the story that got caught up in the grand salvation story of God. His very worst day turned into something that has blessed all of humanity and all those who will believe that this terrible story brought Jesus into the world. This got caught up in God's grand purposes. And I want to share all this because I see so many people who have a detour at some point, whether it's in their work or their vocation or their calling, and they say, that's it, I quit. I back off. Even if you keep doing the job, you quiet quit. Or you get burned in a volunteering situation. You say, that's it, I'm just going to stay home and watch TV now. And we get burned and we back off and you retreat from your calling because of one little detour, when that detour may be the thing that is leading you to the place where you're supposed to be. That detour may be, as it has been the testimony of our family, the very detour that helps to form you into Christ's likeness and to have his heart be formed into your heart. And so if I can tie this all together, the whole point of this is first that God's best stories all start as detours. All of God's best stories. You look through the scriptures, all of his best stories, there's at some point in there where you feel like this has gone terribly wrong. There's a flat tire on the side of the road. How can this thing possibly get moving again? But that detour becomes part of God's great story. But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. And if you're willing to see God's work in the midst of even the detour, then you can unlock beautiful things that happen. So don't rush to cast someone as the villain of your story. And this is really, really important. Because I see so many people who have a detour, who have a heartache, who have a termination story or a layoff story or a failed venture, And like it's the nature of the human heart to want to blame it on somebody. And there might really be a villain in your detour story. There might really be a villain. And if there is, you know what you have to do with them. Forgive them. But often we cast somebody as the villain who really isn't the villain of the story. And we think it's going to make us feel better somehow. In our makeup, we think that casting somebody as the villain is going to give us someone to blame and kind of become the lightning rod for it, when it just poisons your own bloodstream and keeps you from being able to see what God is really doing, what God is really creating in your heart and the opportunities He's really making for you through that detour story. And lastly, detours, they're a part of the journey, not the end of the road. As the band gets ready to come out this morning, I want to tell you that back in May of 2020, not long after as I was sharing the news with some friends and colleagues, I had one pastor I knew who'd been a pastor, had gone to work for a Christian university. I didn't realize that part of his journey had been similar to my journey. And during a point of economic downturn, he was laid off by his university. And he was just relating that story to me, which was so helpful at the time. And then he said these words rang in my ears for years now since. He said, "Steve, there is much life after this. There is much life after this." And he was right. And this morning, maybe if you're in the middle of your detour, if you're in the middle of the worst day that you've ever had at work, or the worst year, or the worst season, there is much life after this. Don't retreat. Don't pull back. Don't quiet quit. Lean in and see if maybe, just maybe, this detour that you're on is actually the path that God needs to take you on to lead you into victory. This morning, appropriately, we're going to end our time with communion. And at a time when the worst of the worst could possibly be happening, on the very night that Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread and took the cup. He said, "This is my body broken for you. This is my blood poured out for you." That the very worst thing that could possibly happen to a Messiah, betrayal and abandonment, that could lead to our salvation. This morning, we're going to take a moment over at Elmira. Brad will lead you through the partaking of these elements. Here at Painted Post, the band is going to lead us in a time of reflection. Then I'll come back up and lead us through. At Victory, we believe in open communion. We practice open communion, which means you don't need to be a member of our church. If you've given your heart to Christ, then it's His invitation to come and receive. And if it's your desire to draw closer to Him, then you can partake of these elements. If you didn't get the elements on your way in, you've got a minute to slip out and grab those. And in just a moment, I'll come back up and lead us through these elements. God, we thank you for the broken roads that you take us down. That you redeem the pain of the stories. For the good, full, beautiful lives that you seem to craft on the other side of detours. And we thank you for the cross. If anything looked like the end of the road, surely Calvary looked like the end of the road. And we thank you that there has been not just much life, but abundant life, eternal life on the other side of Calvary. So, Lord, I pray for my brothers and sisters who are in the middle of a detour, who are in the middle of a really tough season. And maybe for you, there really is a villain in your story, but the villain is you. It's your fault. You got yourself into this mess. And I just invite you to confess that to the Lord. Pray quietly with me in your heart. Lord, I'm sorry. I know I've made a mess of things. And I surrender this story to you. Would you wash me clean? Would you forgive me? Help me to walk in the fullness of life. I proclaim that Jesus Christ is Lord. To the glory of God and the salvation of my soul. And Lord, thank you for the way that this road, as hard as it's been, led me to peace with you.